So, dear Catherine, you started your career at a really young age, 16 if I remember correctly. Can you briefly describe the path that brought you to be such a renowned freelance journalist, especially in the music field?
Oh, renowned. Thank you. That's very nice. Yes, I'm from Los Angeles, California, and as you probably know, there's
Hmm.
always been a big music scene there from, the 1960s and bands like The
Yeah.
Doors, and then the 70s with the Eagles, and then the 80s with Guns N' Roses and the Sunset Strip. So by the time I was 16 years old, I was taking my mother's car to Hollywood, California, and going to clubs and seeing all these bands. And they would have magazines and newspapers at all the clubs, and I would pick them up and read about all the bands. And I thought, well, these aren't written very well. I could do just as well. I can write as good as this. And so I reached out to some of the editors in the magazines and said, I want to write. And they laughed at me, but one of them finally did give me an assignment, and I interviewed my first band when I was probably a little older. I mean, maybe 17 or 18, and then I loved it, and I ended up going to college to study journalism because I wanted to be serious about it and learn things the right way. So that's how my career started, by going to clubs and seeing bands, really.
What can you tell us about the huge work you faced along with John Widerhorn to write Louder Than Hell, the definitive oral history of metal, which also features contributions by Scott Ian and Rob Alford?
Yes, I have to say, when I was in my early 20s, after I got out of college, I worked at a magazine called Rip Magazine in Los Angeles, and John lived in New York. So we only knew each other by phone. There wasn't even any email then. This is in the 90s. This is a little before all that. And so he and I just became friends and writers, and he covered a lot of bands from New York, everyone from Twisted Sister to Anthrax, and me living in Los Angeles covered everyone from, Poison to Guns N' Roses, whoever was there. And then I moved to New York about 11 years ago, maybe 2006, and John said, we have so much material, we've both interviewed so many bands, we should write a book. And I thought, oh no. I thought it would be so difficult, which it was. But he said, I've met a book agent, and he would speak to us about this. So we met with a book agent, and he told us, I think it's a great idea. And so John and I went to a bar and toasted and had, I think, a shot of Jägermeister and said, all right, we're going to write a book. And it took about 4 years to really write the book. A lot of it was because we had all our old interviews from our history of writing. John's interviewed hundreds of musicians, so have I. So we had to look for all the old tapes of our interviews or the transcriptions or the articles that we wrote in, John wrote for Guitar World, so did I, and MTV and Headbangers Ball. So we had to find all our old material, gather that, and then do, maybe 100 new interviews because, we had to have all the current bands and all the current information. And it was very exhausting and confusing because, I think there's like 300 different voices in there, from Phil Anselmo, I think we have all members of Pantera, we have all members of Black Sabbath. So just to get all those interviews and put them together, it was like a giant puzzle. So, but we managed it eventually.
Let's talk about your production activity, Rockline, the Sharon Osbourne Show, and most of all, Nights with Alice Cooper. What can you tell us about this side of your career?
Yeah, it's funny. I grew up listening to the radio and loving all sorts of rock and roll, classic rock radio mostly. And then when I was living in Los Angeles, I was laid off from a job, actually in my job at Rip Magazine. The magazine went away, and I needed to get a job. And a friend said, oh, come work at this radio show, Rockline. And I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a try. And it was sort of like everything I'd grown up listening to on the radio. It was all my favorite classic rock bands. I mean, everyone from, I guess, Foreigner to Peter Frampton to, even Ozzy Osbourne and stuff like that. And it was there was a lot of writing involved in the radio as well, because we had to we had a host named Bob Coburn, and we had to prepare him and do research and, talk to the bands and say, what are we going to talk about? So it was very similar to writing and journalism. So radio was just a lucky extension. I'm lucky I fell into it. A lot of people go to broadcast school and learn how to talk on the air and learn all the technical stuff. But I didn't. So I was really lucky. So I stayed in radio for many years in Los Angeles. And then that radio show, actually, I think what happened, I just left that radio show after about 6 or 7 years from Rockline. And then since I'd interviewed Ozzy so many times, when I found out that Sharon Osbourne was starting her first TV show after they'd had success on the Osbournes, their reality show where they were, Sharon became famous and Ozzy was bumbling around their house. When I reached out to the TV people, I said, "Oh, I've worked with Sharon and Ozzy many times," and so unbelievably, I got my first, actually my only television job, and it was also very much like I used the same skills that I learned, as a journalist. It was booking the bands that were going to be on the TV show, and some of them were bands I'd met before, some weren't, because you can't really have heavy metal on morning TV show in the United States. I couldn't do that. So I had to book more like Dido and just more mellow bands that appealed to women. So that was kind of funny. But Sharon also, she wanted to book heavier bands, but the TV network wouldn't allow us. So I was with that. That show only lasted about a year. TV is very crazy. But then Sharon went on to have really big success with, I can't even remember, or if you have it in Italy, I think it's called The View, which is a talk show where like 5 women sit around and talk about topics of the day. So that's kind of, everything has led to something else. But, it all started with music and knowing people and connections and, making friends, and everything came from there.
Yeah, and how is working with Alice?
Oh, yes, Alice. So, that's, again, it's the exact same thing. I had worked on Rockline for quite a few years, and then I had heard, after the Sharon Osbourne show, someone said, oh, there's a new company, or there's a company trying to start a show with Alice Cooper. And I said, oh, I've met Alice's manager when I interviewed him, and I met Alice. Again, it's all, it's the big circle of life, everyone knowing everyone.
Yeah.
And so I was recommended to the job, and I thought, all right, I was a fan of Alice's, but not a crazy fan. I didn't know every song he'd ever written or anything. But they started this show, it's been almost 14 years ago here at the company I work at, which is United Stations Radio Networks. They syndicate a whole bunch of radio shows, including Alice's. We also, we've worked on radio shows with Sammy Hagar and with Ricky Rackman from Headbangers Ball, and also Dee Snider from Twisted Sister. And so Alice is a workaholic. There's nothing he loves more than work, except golf and being on stage. Yeah. And he makes time for all of it. His show, Nights with Alice Cooper, is on, 25 hours a week. And even when he's on tour, he manages to record it. Yeah. I mean, everyone thinks that it's a live radio show, but he does pre-record it because, he's on stage. He's 71 years old, and he does concerts, maybe 250 nights a year, maybe. It's crazy that someone of that age has the energy. So he's on stage every night, then he'll go back to his room or the tour bus and record a radio show. Yeah. So that's been really, really fun. And he's just, I can't say enough about how great he is. Yeah. He's got 3 children who are wonderful. His son has a band. His daughter is in a band with his bass player. And his wife, Cheryl, they've been together forever. And he's just, the best thing about him, it's funny, he's still so very creative. Yeah. He comes up with new ideas for segments. He follows new bands, whenever he sees them. He especially likes bands kind of like, modern day garage bands, maybe like, like the White Stripes, the Struts. He really likes, kind of modern day Beatles punk garage. Is what he loves.
Yeah, I talked to Alice a few times, and we talked about this topic, and maybe his memories of Detroit and stuff like that.
Yes, Yeah, I mean, he's a big fan of Detroit bands, of course, like especially as I am, like Iggy Pop and Iggy and the Stooges and all that kind of stuff. So we get to play that on his radio show. He's introduced me to a lot of. He likes a lot of old blues
Yeah.
too. I mean, like one of his favorite bands is the Yardbirds. So I've learned a lot. You know, he doesn't know as much about bands like, I don't know, Boston or the Eagles or Foreigner. He doesn't care that much about those, but so I take care of that, and then he brings in all the cool stuff, you know. So it's so fun to work with him.
And how do you work when you do media training for young artists?
Oh, that's another funny thing that happened. You know, there's so many young bands who start when they're maybe 17 or 18, and they're really just kids. And, through my years of being in the music business as a journalist, I meet a lot of people at the publicity companies, at labels, and they say, "Oh, we've got a young band," and they don't talk very well in interviews, or they forget, stories. If you ask them a question, they don't even have good answers. And, since you do so many interviews, maybe you can teach them how to do interviews. Yeah. And that's kind of how this side business started. At first I thought, well, how do you teach someone how to speak or how to talk? But then I realized, you can help someone tell their stories. And young musicians didn't even know, what the press wanted. They were afraid of talking too much. I'm like, well, no, if you're doing an interview, it's your job to talk a lot. Yeah. And I try and teach them to tell, the most interesting stories, not, there's so many cliches out there, as you know, and so I say, don't just say, oh, our band gives 110%. Say, our band stays up till 3 in the morning, and we listen to Led Zeppelin and drink black coffee and do jumping jacks so we can stay up all night and write songs. I said, tell some crazy story, not, so I try and open up their creativity and let them know that journalists, myself especially, want to hear great stories, and so they just can't be afraid to tell them. Yeah. And that it should be, like you and I, like having a conversation. It doesn't have to be like, I was born in Los Angeles and I love writing about bands.
Yeah.
That could be my whole story, but hopefully hopefully I learned to tell the stories too.
Yeah. And you were born in LA, yet you moved to New York City. Which are, in your opinion, the differences between those two cities?
Yeah, the funny thing is, here in America, everyone moves from New York to Los Angeles. That's the direction they go because, New York has bad weather, it has winters and snow, and California is sunny all year long. So I did the opposite, only because, I'd lived in California my entire life, and, at Christmas time you can be at the beach. It's 70 degrees, and it's wonderful, and I love that, but I just wanted to experience a little different lifestyle. So I moved to New York, and I meant to stay here 2 years. And I thought, all right, the 2 years I'll go back to L.A. and see all my friends and, go to Malibu and Venice and all the good places. But it's been, I don't know, 11 or 12 years. There's just so many things to offer in New York. There's really good theater. There's movie stars. And I just saw, let's see, Bryan Cranston. I saw him on TV in Breaking Bad, and now he's on in the Broadway show Network. So there's a lot of theater and a lot of, just a lot more, I guess, art galleries and creative things like that. And of course, as a journalist or in my media training or anything that I do, everyone comes to New York as well. So yeah, initially I just came here for a change, and it was exciting to see snow because I didn't see snow till I was maybe 8 or 10 years old in California, and I had to drive up to the mountains. But now here I can look out my window and, there's snow falling. It seems magical. But, eventually I'll get tired of that magic and the slush. And then, New York, there's so many millions of people. The snow and the streets get all dirty within a few minutes. And then you're like, oh, how can I live here? It's terrible. All this. So both places, I love both. I guess my goal would be to be rich enough so I could, be bi-coastal, live, the summers, I guess, New York gets hot summers, but the beaches aren't as nice or easy. But yeah, I would love to have places in both both parts of the world, I think. Or Italy, if you have a extra room for me, I could come there too.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, that's the good thing about this time in history now, that with the internet you can do almost anything,
Yeah.
Anywhere. So, when I started my career and the internet was just starting, you couldn't do that. We had to fax our stories to magazines and things like that. It was so funny.
I remember.
But now, almost. Alice is proof positive that, he's on tour. He's been to Russia on tour, and he'll do a radio show from Russia, and then so he can do anything anywhere, and mostly I can too. So, yeah. I don't know. Have you been to Los Angeles? Do you like LA versus New York?
Never been there, but I definitely have to check it out to do the comparison.
Yeah, they're both a lot of fun, and I think the people are not that different in both of them, maybe a little bit healthier in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe a little bit, but no, there's people here jogging at midnight down the street, and there's people here at 4 a.m. drunk in the bars. So you have everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have everything in both places. It just depends, I think, how much sun you like.
Okay, which final message and greeting would you send out to the Italian readers of your work?
Well, I would say I'm very excited that I have Italian readers, and that in Louder Than Hell we don't have that many. I can't think of the Italian bands we have, so tell me what bands you love. Tell me about the music of Italy, and I want to know about all rock and roll from all over the world. So tell me everything, Italy.